I'm Dr. John Neufeld, and you're watching Back to the Bible Canada. Delighted to have you join me, starting a new series on the book of Genesis, or I should say Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. I think it's foundational for the Christian faith. Hey, if you've never read a Bible, you pick it up and you open up the Bible, it's a big book, and I guess most people start from the beginning and start to read there. But if you never have, let me suggest that you don't start at the beginning, but you start about 3/4 of the way through. Start with the book of Luke and get a sense of the person of Jesus. Luke will give you a history of Jesus. He'll introduce you to him, what he did, what his life signifies. And when you read through slowly, because as you read through slowly, you'll begin to savor and take some notes. What are the questions that you have? What are the things that you learn? That kind of thing. But eventually, as you learn the basis of the Christian faith, at some point in time, you're going to want to start at the beginning of the book and start to work your way through. I have a habit of working my way through the entire Bible every year. It's not very hard to do. If you give yourself to about 15 minutes of reading a day, it's easy to get through it. But Genesis is foundational for the Christian faith. But having said that, let me also say that from my vantage point, Genesis is for a great many Christians problematic. Because there's this niggling feeling in the back of many heads, and it goes like this: but isn't it really pre-scientific? And now that we live in a scientific era, the stuff in the early part of the Bible, can we really still hold to that literally? Can that still be true? Or if I believe it to be true, do I have to become unscientific to believe that? So I'm going to help you through that, and I'm going to take away, if I can, all the cringe factor of reading this, and to read this with a deep sense of joy, insight, understanding. Genesis really does form the foundation for the entire Bible. If you know this one book, you should know where the entire book is going. But before I get into the actual details of what we find here, let me suggest to you that Genesis answers 7 foundational questions that I think every single human being asks. Question number 1, who is God? The book begins by saying, in the beginning, God. And the beginning of what? Well, the beginning of created matter. Before anything that is natural, made of nature, anything in the physical universe existed, there was this one solitary God. God is a non-contingent being. And I mean by that his life is not dependent on any outside factors. God depends on nothing for his existence, but everything that exists depends on him for existence. So, the question of who is God is addressed in this chapter. The second question that we have in the book of Genesis that's answered is, who are we? What does it mean to be human? I think it's an important question because of the day in which we live. There are 2 issues that kind of divide Canadians, North Americans, and it has to do with the question of abortion and the question of end-of-life issues. What is the nature of human life? Is it different to take a dog who's suffering and to euthanize the dog than for a human being? I mean, is there something unique about being human? Is life only good when it's convenient and the conditions are right, or does life have purpose in and of itself? What does it mean to be human? Are we only biological organisms, or is there something more to us? Genesis will explore that in great depth. So, who is God? Secondly, who are we? The third question, I think, that's asked and answered in Genesis is this question: what is life for? It's an important question because there are a lot of people that go through life and say, I don't know what my purpose is in life. I'm going to argue that one of the reasons why people struggle with depression and aimlessness and end up in destructive patterns of their own lives is because they don't know who they are and what they're for. Genesis 1:26 has God speaking to man, and he says, rule over the creation. rule on behalf of God. There is something about expressing dominion over all the works of God's hands that God has entrusted to those who are made in his image. So who are we? We're made in the image of God. What are we to do? We are to rule over God's creation. We need some time to unpack that, but that's really here in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. A fourth question, what is sex all about? In our world, we think we know what it's all about. Sex is about, pleasure. In some places, sex is about expressing power over someone else. But in reality, as you read through Genesis, sex is really about procreation. It is about filling the earth with image bearers of God. Let me unpack that just a bit. It's not that Genesis is unaware that sex is about pleasure. But the reason why God packaged procreation of the next generation in a pleasure package is because he had insisted that one man and one woman would be intimate with each other and be open with each other, to be naked and unashamed with each other, so that out of intimacy and out of love and out of a declaration of interdependence with one another, the future generation would come into being. I want to say a lot more about that as we study through these chapters. So I've got who is God, who are we, what's life for, what's sex all about. Number 5, what is the true state of the human condition? Are we essentially good or are we essentially evil? We have all those questions running around in our minds because as we look at the human condition, we do see this potentiality for excellence. We are this being in the world that's unlike everything else that's here. And we have the ability to cure diseases. We have the ability to act in ways that are clearly loving towards others, and yet there is this overwhelming ability to be cruel. Much of the world's technology is directed towards doing harm to one another. The weapons of warfare. The nations of the world pour their energy, they say, into defense, but it also means in terms of war and domination of others. So the question of what is the true state of the human condition is a question that receives a great deal of discussion in everyday life. And Genesis, which is a revelation from God to us, helps us to understand our true condition and what to do about our true condition. Because Genesis will teach us that we are both in the image of God, and yet we have fallen from our Creator, so that there exists now this division between us and our Creator. We've lost our way, and an evil impulse has come in us. Well, question number 6. Why is the human race divided? I know that question doesn't come up in the first 3 chapters. You have to keep reading all the way until you get to Genesis chapter 11. But it's a wonderful depiction of the division of the human race and why that's occurred, and also what that actually means in everyday life, and whether or not the division of the human race is a good thing or a bad thing. The answers there might surprise you. We're not going to have time to deal with that, but essentially God divides the human race to prevent us from using all of our resources together to create evil, which is on an unparalleled scale. God has deliberately put limitations on the human experience. That's in Genesis. The final question that we have is, where are we going? One way we can answer or ask the question and then answer it is to say that history is not cyclical. History is linear. And when I say that, I mean that history is actually going somewhere. It has a starting point, and we now see that scientists are agreeing with that. There is a first point of creation, whether scientists call that the Big Bang or something else, but there is a beginning point in which all matter comes into existence, and because of the law of entropy, all things will eventually wind down and cease to exist. It's not that things just keep on going in cyclical fashion over and over again, as you find in pantheistic religions. In fact, the nature of things is such that history is actually going through a course of events. It's going somewhere. And in fact, it has started somewhere and leading to a natural conclusion. So these are the foundation blocks of human thinking. These are the things that every human being is interested in. We simply can't entertain our lives away and not ask these profound questions about what the human experience is all about and what our Creator is all about. But I'm going to give you a final bonus question. I promised you only 7, but I'm going to add one to it. And the final bonus question is really this. How is God known? I mean, how do we come to know our Creator? I know there are lots of people that will claim they've got a special pipeline. They hear God speaking to them personally. And I don't always know how to take that kind of evidence, because some people are not to be trusted. I don't know how else to say that. We have some people who would love to have the limelight, or are so egocentric that they believe that they have an in with God that no one else has. What I'm going to say is simply this. We know that the great Creator has revealed himself to human beings, and he's done so in a number of ways. The first way in which he did that is through creation itself. God revealed himself in creation. We're going to say a whole awful lot more about that, but if you look at a Rembrandt or any other great painting by a master, you'll know something about the master by viewing the works of his hands. Indeed, you can know something about the Creator by viewing the creation. The creation itself teaches us about the Creator. Now, I'm going to say something about that, and I'm going to say eventually there is something to be learned in the scientific enterprise. I think that proposition that has been made now on numerous occasions, that if one properly looks at creation itself, we can see that creation is the product of intelligence. There are words that people use, intelligent design. Indeed, design is found all around us, and it tells us something about the designer. We also know that God has revealed himself in history. God reveals himself in the Bible as the God of history. He is the God who has revealed himself in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in Moses, in David. I mean, there are all sorts of figures in the Bible whom God has not only spoken to, but done things in, and it is there in history itself that we learn something about the Creator, that he is intimate and speaks to people and enters into covenant with people. So that's here as well. God is also known because he has disclosed himself in the person of his Son. That is, the great Creator actually entered into the creation 2,000 years ago in the person of Jesus and demonstrated his glory in him. And therefore we have come to know him, that is the Creator, through his own Son whom he sent into the world. Ultimately, what the Bible is a record of God's revelation of himself to the human race. And so when the Bible begins in the book of Genesis, it begins the story, which it ends in the book of Revelation. I'm going to say this about the entire Bible. The Bible tells one story, but because it's the story of a one true God, it's sometimes difficult for us to follow. We would expect that, but the more we spend time at it, the more we grow in this. But that brings me back to Genesis. I've mentioned just briefly that there are people who, when they think about the book of Genesis, they have what I like to call a cringe factor. They have this nasty feeling back there in the back of their heads that Genesis and science are at polar opposites. I mean, if you believe the book of Genesis, you're an anti-science person. If you believe in science, well, you can't hold to this ancient document. So there's that feeling in a lot of people's minds, and I'm going to try to dispel that today, and I'm going to help us to understand somewhere about where Genesis goes. Now, before I begin to read the first 2 verses, and that's really all I'm going to do today, but before I read those verses, I'm going to preface what I'm going to say by making a statement. The Bible doesn't tell us everything about everything. I mean, the Bible never discusses the human genetic code. If you want to know something about human genetics, the Bible will tell you nothing about it. The Bible's not a book essentially about scientific details. Doesn't mean it's not true, but there are a great many scientific details the Bible never seeks to address. Well, there are a lot of other things the Bible doesn't address. The Bible doesn't address the history of the greater part of Asia or Europe or the Americas. The Bible focuses in on very particular story. It's about the Creator, His creation, and also about His covenant that He makes with His chosen people. So that's the content of the Bible. So for those of us who want to make the Bible speak to absolutely everything, I think we're going to be disappointed. On the other hand, what the Bible does tell us, it tells us truly. And so I'm going to say that at the outset. Is the book of Genesis a scientific account? Well, I'm going to say it's not an account that is at odds with science, but it certainly doesn't deal with scientific data as we understand it. I'll help to get to that as we continue to go through. So we realize in Genesis that there is a beginning. So let me start to read what the very first verse, the very first sentence in the Bible. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, when it begins by saying, in the beginning, please don't think it's the beginning of God. God is portrayed throughout the Bible as essential life in and of Himself. A God who needs no factors out of Himself to exist. He exists by necessity. In the beginning of the physical material universe, God created. In the beginning, where there was no nature at all, but now nature has come into existence. In the beginning of natural phenomena, that's what the beginning is all about. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We start with that. Now, we note then, as we read the first verse in the Bible, that there's a fundamental distinction between God, or the Creator, and the creation. In the beginning, God created the creation, so that, we're not left with pantheism in which, God is assumed to be a part of the lakes and the rivers and the trees and the sun and the moon, so that we worship the natural forces of the world. We don't. In fact, we never confuse the creator-creation distinction. There is a fundamental divide between material matter and the Creator, who is Himself spirit. We need to continue to hold that that's what the Bible teaches. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Therefore, the natural world exists from Him. Okay, now, I want to address something else in Genesis 1, verse 1, that sometimes I think people have never quite grasped the importance of the question that I raise now. When you read Genesis 1, verse 1, the very first line in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What is it that we've just read? See, for some people, when they read Genesis 1, verse 1, they think of it as a headline. You pick out a newspaper, and the newspaper has a headline. The headline says, the economy of the country is shrunk by 2%. And then when we go to read the actual document, we'll find out how that's actually true. And so when people read Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, they assume that's the headline. And now we're going to find out how God did it. And I'm going to say Genesis 1, verse 1 is definitely not a headline. If you think it is, you're going to get the wrong idea before you even begin to read. And here's why. As we begin to read through the first chapter of Genesis, for instance, in verse 6, it'll say, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. And you say, where did the waters come from? Because there's not one line in this text that tells us that God created the waters. But there is. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So I'm going to assume that Genesis 1:1 is not a headline, but is the first in a sequence of events. Event number one, God created the cosmos. The heavens and the earth means the planet Earth, but also all of the rest of the cosmos, the universe, along with our own galaxy. God created that. So we have only one line in the entire Bible about the creation of the entire universe. That's it. I mean, you get, later on in the book of Psalms, which is a book of the poetry and the worship songs of ancient Israel. In Psalm 19, verse 1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." So that is, the created order declares the glory of the Creator himself. But that doesn't tell us how God did it. It just simply says that he did it. It's one thing to say, and use my example of a painting again. I'm going to say that painting is a Rembrandt. And when I say that, you might say, well, but you haven't told me how Rembrandt painted it. I don't know whether he used watercolors or oil colors. I don't know what kind of a brush he used. I don't know the kind of brush strokes. You've simply said, this is Rembrandt. And in fact, that's what Genesis 1 verse 1 is. It doesn't tell us whether there are immediate or intermediate causes in which God uses to create the universe. It's just that he did it. So again, the scientific details aren't here, but there's a theological formula. This is the product of God. Now, once we've said that, I come to the next verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And verse 2, which is the next sentence, says, the earth was, and I'll stop there. Because I've already made the point that Genesis doesn't tell us everything about everything. Genesis is not going to tell us anything about Alpha Centauri. It's not going to tell us anything about, the planet Venus. It's not going to tell us about the chemical composition of the sun. This book is about what happens on Earth. This is about God's unique creation on this one planet. Now, we look at this and say, yeah, well, that happens to be where we live. Yes, it is. But it's also true that at least as far as we know up till now, we've not yet found a planet that's like the earth. This is this unique planet in the whole sphere of God's created order. There seems to be something special about his project here. And indeed, this book, the entire Bible, is about what God did on the earth. So we have the statement, God creates the cosmos. The next step is to say, now the earth, because that's what we're going to talk about. And then Moses, who wrote Genesis, says the earth was without form and void. Stop there because it's an interesting statement. So speaking about the earth, which now has been created, and I would argue along with the sun, the moon, the stars, all of the other planets are all there. Therefore, now we get to concentrating on the earth, and we read that the earth was without form and void. Well, what does it mean? In the Hebrew, it says the earth was tohu va bohu. Va simply means and. The earth was tohu and bohu at the same time. Now, what does that mean? We know that as you hear it said, you know that it's a rhyming couplet. Tohu va bohu. I had one Hebrew professor who told me that if you think about tohu va bohu, it's kind of like saying hanky-panky. If you want to know what hanky-panky is, you don't start by understanding what hanky is and then what panky is. It's the rhyming couplet together that is meaningful to us. We also know that this tohu va bohu is used in two other places in the Bible, once in Isaiah and once in the book of Jeremiah. And in those places, it simply speaks about a place that's a howling wasteland, unfit for human habitation. I think we can read it this way. The earth was this howling wasteland. It was unfit for the habitation of anything. In fact, nothing lived. It was like most of the planets, and maybe all of the planets, I don't know. The Bible doesn't address the question of life on other planets, but it's like so many of the planets, there is no life there at all. The earth was without form and void. It was a howling wasteland, and darkness was over the face of the deep. In other words, it was not only a howling wasteland, it's dark there. Later on, when we talk about the 6 days of creation, and I'll explain that as we go on, but we'll learn that on day one, God says, let there be light. So at some point in time, actual light penetrates onto the surface of the earth, and things begin to change. But initially, says Genesis, there was a time when this planet was simply a howling wasteland on which nothing lived, and it was dark. We know that there are planets throughout our universe now that have atmospheric conditions that do not allow any light at all to penetrate to the surface. And Genesis says there was a time when the earth was like that. Now you stop for a moment, you think about what's just been said. In our scientific modality, we'll often ask the question, well, how long was it like that? And the answer is Genesis has no intention to even address the question. I mean, we might say that's something for scientists to address. I mean, how old is this earth? I'm going to argue Genesis says nothing at all to that question. It may have been a howling wasteland for billions of years, or it may have been that way for an hour and a half. I mean, the fact is, Genesis doesn't address the issue. Again, I'm saying what should be obvious by now. The Bible doesn't tell us everything about everything. It simply says, at one point in time, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Now, the deep is going to refer to waters. So there were waters on the face of the earth. So that's fascinating, but it was a dark place. I mean, perhaps it was cold, perhaps it was something else. And then it goes on to say, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. You stop here because Genesis introduces us to something that we've not yet seen. Who is the Spirit of God? Later on, as we continue to read through the Bible, we'll find out that there is but one God, and that the one God has eternally existed as three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But early on, we'll find out that there's simply a complexity in God. The one God is more complex than we had imagined. That's all we know up to this point in time. But here we read that the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, meaning that he was superintending it, that he was holding it in such a way that would later introduce purpose onto this earth. And here's the real issue here. What does purpose actually entail? In the next section on Genesis, we will find that God, over a period of 6 days, speaks purpose into this void, purposeless planet called Earth. What Genesis wants to teach us is that God imposed a special purpose onto this planet. There's something unique and special that he has done right here. And he does it over a period of 6 days. So I guess I could say technically that the 6 days of creation are not the 6 days of creation, but they are the 6 days of the creation of purpose onto this, this howling wasteland, which was planet Earth. God has spoken his purpose, which means to us that the book of Genesis is here to teach us that there's a reason why this planet is unique. It's about to tell us why that's the case. You see what I've said up to this point in time? Genesis hasn't told us how old the planet is, but it has told us that the planet exists for a purpose. And that purpose will begin to be worked out throughout the pages of the Bible. But it will also tell us how the earth went from this howling wasteland, or tohu vabohu, or formless and void, from a place that was like this into a place that we know today, a place that's rich and teeming with life, a place that's become our home, a place where life comes all around us, and a place where we have meaning and reflect upon the nature of the Creator. Why is our planet like this? And that brings us back to the great questions about life. Who is God? Who am I? What is the earth that I live on? Is there purpose and meaning in this life? Was I created for purpose, or do I simply exist by happenstance in which nothing I ever do means anything? Let me tell you a story that I had a conversation with an individual who for many years was a very dear friend. He was an atheist and he was also a scientist. I used to have him come and teach in a class that I was teaching called Christianity and Contemporary Thought. And so I asked him to take one class and tell the class why he was an atheist. And I remember one line that he used to say, and he said it with great effect, but it went something like this. He said, if there was a nuclear explosion or some cataclysmic event, maybe we're hit by a massive comet on the earth, he said, if all human life was extinguished tomorrow, there would be no one to watch, there would be no one to care, and he said, and it wouldn't mean anything. Now you think about that. If that man's right about that, then your entire life is completely meaningless, and everything that you've ever done means nothing in the great scheme of things. I know we lie to ourselves about this. There are people that in obituaries say, always remembered, but that's just not the case. Nobody's always remembered. So if my atheist scientist is true, then it doesn't matter if you help a little old lady across the street because you had compassion on her, or whether you murder her and steal her purse. It doesn't matter. It don't mean a thing either way. That's fascinating. How many of us can live that way? And the answer is we simply can't. There's something that's implanted within us that rebels against that. No, I was given purpose. And so the rest of Genesis chapter 1 is the story of God imposing his purpose on this planet. And in the end of the day, he puts a human pair on this planet and tells them to rule and reign over his creation. I'm giving you purpose, there's meaning, and it's going somewhere. I'm going to speak to anyone that's, perhaps listening to me now and is saying, I've just never known what my life was all about. I don't know why I exist. I don't know if there's a God. I don't know if the Bible's true. I don't really know a lot about the Bible. My encouragement is to continue to watch this series through the first 3 chapters of Genesis and begin to find that you're gaining a foundation for a life that can be meaningful and rich and hope-filled and lead you through to eternity. Genesis forms the foundation for all of this. I take you back again to Genesis chapter 19 and verse 1. Genesis 19, verse 1. It simply says, the heavens declare the glory of God. Once you understand Genesis, you'll begin to recognize that the world that you live in and the Creator who brought it into being and who you are as a human being, it all somehow begins to fit together and life begins to work for a purpose. We were created for purpose, and God wants us to know what that is. I'm going to ask that you just don't give up very quickly on this. No matter what you've heard about Genesis, let's keep reading it through and find out what the Creator has to say to us. Eventually, it will lead us to the story of Jesus Christ and the fulfillment of all God's purposes. Thanks for watching today, and continue to join us as we work our way through the book of Genesis, the first 3 chapters. God bless you and have a wonderful day.